At nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, where the air thins and every breath feels borrowed, there lies a lake unlike any other. For most of the year, Roopkund remains frozen, sealed under sheets of ice, guarded by towering peaks of the Indian Himalayas. But every summer, as the snow melts and the water recedes, the mountain reveals a secret that has baffled generations. Hundreds upon hundreds of human skeletons scattered across its floor, as though death itself had chosen this place as its throne. When British officials stumbled upon the site in 1942, they thought at first it must have been the remnants of some forgotten battle. Soldiers cut down by frostbite or ambushed on a desolate pass, perhaps. But as they pressed closer, their disbelief deepened. The bones were not buried, nor arranged in any order. They were strewn wildly across the rocky bed of the lake, tangled together, as if a moment of horror had frozen them in time. Skulls, femurs, rib cages, and spines lay side by side, bleached by the sun and preserved by the cold. It was not a handful of bodies. It was an entire multitude. More than 200 skeletons, men and women alike, some still with remnants of hair, jewelry, and clothing clinging stubbornly to the remains. The stark question clawed at the imagination of every witness. What catastrophe had driven so many people into the clutches of death at such an unforgiving altitude, where survival even for a few is a daily battle? The scene was a paradox of silence and violence. Silence, because the lake sat in one of the loneliest, most isolated stretches of the Himalayas, far from villages and trade routes. Violence, because every bone seemed to whisper of suddenness, of calamity, of a force so overwhelming that no one had escaped. The lake earned a name in local lore that has haunted it ever since, the Skeleton Lake. For the villagers living in the shadow of these peaks, the discovery was no surprise. They had long carried stories of spirits and curses that dwelled near the water. Legends passed down for centuries told of travelers who dared disturb the lake and never returned. To them, the British were not unearthing a mystery. They were merely catching up with what the mountains had already spoken. The lake was a forbidden place, and the bones were its eternal warning. But folklore, as chilling as it was, could not satisfy the hunger of science. Over the decades that followed, researchers, archaeologists, and geneticists all descended upon the lake, searching for answers in the fragments of bone and the DNA that still clung to them. Each investigation only seemed to deepen the riddle. Radiocarbon dating revealed something stranger still. The skeletons did not all belong to one event. Some dated back more than 1,200 years, while others were as recent as 180 years ago. This was not one tragedy, but many, unfolding across centuries, all bound to the same icy tomb. What was it about this remote lake that pulled lives into its depths across such vast spans of time? Was it coincidence? A pattern of human pilgrimage that ended in disaster again and again? Or was the lake itself a magnet for misfortune, a place where geography and fate conspired against human survival? The skeletons themselves offered haunting details. Many bore deep cracks along the skulls, as though struck by blunt objects from above. Yet there were no signs of battle, no weapons scattered across the ground. Instead, the evidence suggested something far more sinister and far more unusual. These people may have been struck down by the sky itself. Scientists began to suspect an event almost unthinkable, that the dead of Roopkund had been killed not by human hand, but by a storm of hailstones, massive and deadly, falling with such force that skulls shattered like glass. Imagine standing at 16,000 feet, trapped on a narrow mountain path when a sudden storm descends. There is no shelter, no cave, no tree to hide beneath. Only open sky and the sharp sting of ice hurled down like stones by an indifferent heaven. A moment of chaos, people screaming, stumbling, clutching their heads as the blows rained down. Within minutes, a caravan could be reduced to silence, its members sprawled across the ground, motionless, left to freeze where they fell. The bones of Roopkund whisper of that violence still. Cracked skulls and broken spines, untouched by the weapons of war, but scarred by something far colder. And yet, even this explanation did not solve the full puzzle. Why were their skeletons separated by centuries? Why did they return, again and again, to this remote place? One theory ties the mystery to pilgrimage. Ancient songs of the region speak of a goddess who watches the lake, a deity who punishes those who defy her sacred land. The tales warn of a group of travelers, perhaps a royal procession, who ignored these warnings and were struck down by a storm unleashed from the goddess's wrath. The science of hailstones and the poetry of legend overlap here, both pointing to a fate that fell from the sky. But other remains, with different ages and different genetic markers, suggest that more than one story is etched into these bones. Some belong to people of South Asian origin, while others carried ancestry linked to the Mediterranean, raising new questions about how far travelers had come and why they converged at this one desolate lake. The more we learn, the more the skeleton lake resists being understood. It is a graveyard that was never meant to be one, a place that unites science and myth, fact and folklore. Every bone is a fragment of a story, but no story is complete. It is as if the mountain itself has chosen to keep its secret, allowing only glimpses, hints, whispers carried on the freezing wind. And so, to stand at Roopkund today is to confront not only death, but mystery in its purest form. The lake is still, the bones still lie scattered beneath the thawing ice, and the questions still linger like shadows. What force brought these lives together across centuries, only to abandon them here in silence? Was it divine punishment, as the villagers believe? A freak of weather, as the scientists propose? Or perhaps something else, hidden still in the folds of time? The truth, like the lake itself, remains frozen, waiting for those willing to brave the altitude, the silence, and the unsettling weight of hundreds of forgotten lives staring back from the ice. The Himalayas are often called the roof of the world, but those who have walked beneath their shadow know them as something else entirely, a realm of both awe and terror. These peaks rise not just as mountains, but as titans, towering walls of rock and ice that defy human ambition. To many, they are sacred, whispered to be the dwelling place of gods. To others, they are merciless executioners. And in the middle of this brutal theater of nature lies Roopkund, a frozen jewel with a darker purpose, a silent graveyard where beauty and death intertwine. Avalanches thunder across the slopes with little warning, burying everything in their path under tons of snow and crushing ice. Winds scream like living creatures, clawing at skin, tearing tents from the ground, and stripping away warmth faster than a fire can be lit. In this realm, a single mistake means surrendering to a force older and far less forgiving than any human adversary. Yet the brutality of the Himalayas is not confined to its storms alone. The air itself becomes an enemy. At altitudes above 16,000 feet, where Roopkund rests, oxygen thins to a cruel trickle. Each breath feels borrowed, as though stolen from a reluctant sky. The body weakens, muscles ache, the heart pounds in desperation, and even thought itself becomes sluggish, as if weighed down by the mountain's invisible hand. It is here, in this hostile domain, that Roopkund Lake holds its secrets. A place so remote, so treacherous, that even today, only the most determined trekkers reach its edge. The path leading there cuts through steep ridges, icy passes, and knife-edge trails where one misstep can send a traveler plunging into oblivion. Snowfall erases footprints within minutes, leaving behind only silence. And yet, centuries ago, a large group of people, men, women, perhaps even children, found themselves here, far from safety, high above the world. That fact alone deepens the mystery. For why would such a gathering make its way into this heart of danger? And how could they, burdened by supplies, by age, by vulnerability, survive long enough to reach a lake that even modern mountaineers approach with reverence? Roopkund itself is no ordinary lake. Its surface, for most of the year, lies beneath a glassy sheet of ice. In summer, the thaw reveals something far more sinister. Human remains scattered along the shore, floating beneath the clear water, or lodged in the frozen soil. Hundreds of skeletons, preserved by the cold, rest here as if time itself has refused to move them forward. To gaze into its waters is to stare directly into a chapter of history that never closed. This is no gentle resting place. It is a trap perfectly set by nature's design. Surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs and mountainsides, Roopkund is encircled like a pit from which there is no easy escape. Sudden snowstorms can sweep across the basin, cutting off retreat. Rock slides descend without warning, crushing those who wander too close to the slopes. Even the weather seems deliberately cruel, sunlight glaring fiercely in one moment, frost descending like a shroud the next. For those caught here centuries ago, there could have been no reprieve, no safe passage downward once disaster struck. But the lake's position adds to the riddle. At nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, it is not a place one simply stumbles upon. Villages rest far below, where conditions are less severe, where crops can grow and animals survive. For a large group to climb so high without the aid of modern gear speaks to purpose. It suggests pilgrimage, desperation, or perhaps exile. Yet whatever drew them upward, the mountain itself awaited like a patient predator. Mountaineers who speak of the Himalayas often describe the sensation of being watched, not by wildlife or companions, but by the mountain itself. There is an eerie intelligence to its silence, as though each ridge and cliff judges those who dare trespass. Climbers call certain peaks killer mountains, not in exaggeration, but in remembrance of the lives they have claimed. Annapurna, Nanga Parbat, Kangchenjunga, these are names etched with loss. Roopkund may be smaller, less renowned, but its title is no less fitting. A mountain of death. Imagine, then, the group that once found themselves standing at its shore. Imagine the exhaustion in their legs, the thin air burning their lungs, the despair of realizing that turning back was impossible. The lake before them, surrounded by walls of stone, must have looked both miraculous and menacing. Water in such a barren place is a treasure. But within this treasure lay their doom. One by one, the mountain would strip them of warmth, of strength, and of hope, until only bone remained. To understand Roopkund is to understand that nature itself can be the greatest conspirator. It kills without malice, without reason, without even acknowledgement of those it destroys. Yet in its indifference, it has preserved these skeletons, keeping them locked in ice for generations, waiting for the day when curious eyes would once again fall upon them. And so, the lake does not merely hold bones, it holds the story of human fragility, of ambition colliding with forces too vast to comprehend. Those who visit today often speak of the silence, how the air feels heavier near the water, how even laughter falls flat against the stone walls encircling the basin. To look at Roopkund is to confront mortality in its rawest form. The skeletons are not ancient relics placed carefully in tombs. They are the remains of people caught mid-journey, frozen in defeat, stripped of identity. They did not expect their final breath to be taken here, at the edge of a desolate lake in the high Himalayas. And yet the mountain decided otherwise. Perhaps that is what makes this place so haunting. Every skeleton is a question unanswered. Every skull is a story untold. And the mountain, in its eternal silence, refuses to answer. Roopkund is not just a location on a map. It is a reminder that in some places, humans are not pioneers, not conquerors, but intruders. It is the lake of frozen time, where the arrogance of survival collides with the certainty of death. And as we peer into its icy depths, we realize something chilling. The mountain never needed to hide its secrets. It simply waited. The year was 1942, and the British Raj was on edge. War raged across continents, and whispers of Japanese invasion reached deep into India's isolated valleys. When a patrol of British officials stumbled upon a high-altitude lake littered with skeletons, their first assumption felt both logical and terrifying. Surely, these were Japanese soldiers, infiltrators who had braved the treacherous Himalayan passes to strike at India's vulnerable frontier. But as the initial shock faded, a troubling detail emerged. The bones were not fresh. They were old, weathered, and strangely brittle, as though they had rested here long before the war itself. The skulls bore no helmets, the skeletal remains carried no uniforms, and the brittle fragments of flesh that clung to them did not belong to soldiers who had fallen in recent battle. What looked like a wartime tragedy was something altogether stranger. British intelligence feared a cover-up. The lake lay in a remote pocket of the Himalayas where superstition still lingered in the air, and the discovery threatened to stir panic among local populations. In a world where propaganda was as powerful as bullets, the very idea that hundreds of Japanese bodies might be rotting near sacred mountains risked fueling rumors of secret invasions. But the evidence simply refused to match the story. Colonial officials pressed forward with their own makeshift investigation. They cataloged what they could: skulls shattered clean through, rib cages fractured, and skeletons strewn chaotically around the icy basin. The scene was grotesque not only for its scale, but for its silence. There were no weapons, no signs of battle. Just bones, dozens, then hundreds, tangled together in mud, ice, and stone. The first theory beyond warfare was mass suicide. Perhaps some speculated a desperate group had wandered into this desolate alpine zone, overcome with starvation or despair, and chosen to perish together. Yet even that grim idea faltered. The injuries did not match poison or starvation. These were broken bodies, not wasted ones. Their skulls seemed cracked by blunt trauma, their skeletons scattered as though thrown into violence rather than surrender. Then came darker whispers. Could it have been ritual sacrifice? Had an ancient tribe or sect led these men and women to their deaths in a bloody offering to the mountain gods? The British were not strangers to stories of cults, of sacred rites whispered in hidden valleys. But even as the colonial officials entertained this possibility, it crumbled beneath the weight of the evidence. No shrines, no carvings, no tools of ritual execution were ever found. The bones, stripped of context, stood against such claims. Executions were also suggested. The idea that some unknown army or ruler had dragged these people into the mountains to die. A punishment so brutal it would leave no survivors to tell the tale. But once again, the theory dissolved. Who would march hundreds into the Himalayas, across inhospitable glaciers, only to slaughter them at the foot of an alpine lake? The logistics alone defied reason. Every early explanation ended the same way: unsatisfying, incomplete, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The colonial officers wrote their reports with frustration, penning lines filled with speculation rather than clarity. And yet, their words betray something deeper: unease. For each broken skull, each scattered fragment, whispered of an event so sudden and catastrophic, it left no chance of order, no chance of survival. The whispers among the locals deepened the mystery further. Villagers living miles below the lake told stories of cursed ground, of a place avoided by shepherds and hunters alike. Some even claimed the mountain itself had rejected those who came uninvited. The colonial record keepers dismissed such superstitions, but behind their skepticism lingered a subtle admission. No matter how rationally they tried to explain it, the bones belonged to no single narrative. Imagine the unease of those investigators, climbing into the thin air, their boots crunching over the ice, each step echoing over a graveyard without a name. They had arrived expecting to confirm an invasion. Instead, they found themselves staring into a riddle that mocked the Empire's own authority. The truth of the matter was simple. The bones did not belong to soldiers of the Second World War. They belonged to something older, something that slipped between the folds of history and myth. And though the British officials closed their files with unsatisfactory conclusions, they had unknowingly laid the groundwork for one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries the Himalayas would ever yield. Because beneath their crude theories, suicide, sacrifice, execution was the one undeniable fact no one could erase. Hundreds of lives ended here, violently, inexplicably, and together. And for every theory they put forward, the bones themselves answered with silence. For centuries, the wind that rushed through the high valleys carried not just the chill of snow, but echoes of an old warning. In the villages scattered along the Himalayan foothills, families gathered by dim firelight and sang songs that seemed more cautionary than celebratory. These were not mere folk tales of love and harvest, but dirges disguised as stories, accounts of divine anger, of a mountain spirit who had once unleashed her fury upon a royal caravan. The lyrics of these songs shifted subtly from village to village, yet their core remained unchanged. A king, proud and unyielding, had dared to test the sanctity of the mountains. Some versions said he brought his queen and courtiers on a pilgrimage, not with reverence, but with arrogance, treating sacred land as if it were his private stage. Others sang of a general and his soldiers, desecrating shrines, plucking flowers forbidden to mortals, or attempting to conquer a goddess's territory. In every telling, the mountain did not forgive. It was said that the skies themselves grew heavy. The goddess, insulted by human intrusion, released her rage in the form of icy stones that fell like punishment from above. The caravan, unable to flee, was struck down where they stood. Their bones, scattered in the snow, were left as an eternal warning. The Himalayas belonged not to kings or soldiers, but to gods alone. These were not myths whispered in passing. They were sung over and over with the cadence of memory. Mothers would hush their children with them. Priests would recall them during rituals, and wandering storytellers turned them into cautionary epics. The villagers believed the skeletons, half buried in glacial ice, occasionally glimpsed by herders, were proof that arrogance had a cost. Proof that the goddess's wrath was not a story, but a history etched into bone. What makes these songs extraordinary is how eerily close they align with truths uncovered many centuries later. Long before science entered the valley with excavation tools and genetic testing kits, these melodies already painted a vivid picture. A group of travelers, suddenly struck down not by sword or famine, but by something falling from the sky. In verse, it was divine punishment. In fact, it may have been one of the rarest and deadliest weather events nature can produce. To the villagers, the curse was not abstract. They could point to the very lake, Roopkund, the so-called Skeleton Lake, and claim with unshakable conviction that this was where the king and his retinue met their end. The stories spoke of jewelry and ornaments that had once glittered among the bones, evidence of noble bloodlines lost to vengeance. There were whispers that the haunting music of anklets could still be heard in the silence of night, as if the queen's entourage still wandered, trapped between life and myth. The strength of folklore lies not in accuracy, but in persistence. Over generations, the villagers safeguarded a memory of catastrophe without knowing they were describing a real phenomenon. When researchers centuries later uncovered that dozens of individuals at Roopkund had died from massive blunt force trauma to the skull, trauma eerily consistent with being struck by something heavy falling from above, the ancient ballads suddenly shifted from mere superstition to something far more unsettling. It raised a question few dared articulate aloud. Could memory survive in song long after the facts were lost? Could an entire culture encode the story of a disaster so faithfully that when the truth finally surfaced, it would mirror their myths almost perfectly? In this way, the songs of the curse did more than entertain. They were the guardians of a past event that would otherwise have been swallowed by ice and silence. They provided continuity, a bridge between bones in the lake and the living villagers who still, centuries later, warned strangers never to anger the mountain. The haunting nature of these ballads also carried psychological weight. When sung, they didn't sound like distant legends, but like warnings meant for those still alive. Their refrains often described the mountain as a living entity, watching, judging, and waiting. To grow up hearing them was to internalize the sense that the landscape itself possessed morality. That nature was both sacred and punitive. Every crack of thunder, every sudden storm, seemed like an echo of that ancient curse. And perhaps that was the truest power of the folklore. It instilled respect or fear in those who lived nearest the danger. Villagers did not climb where they were not welcome. Pilgrims entered the mountains with offerings, not arrogance. Whether the goddess was real or not mattered less than the behavioral outcome. The songs kept people alive. But for outsiders, especially colonial explorers, who stumbled upon the skeletons in the early 20th century, the tales were dismissed as primitive superstition. They wrote of myths with a tone of detachment, failing to see that these stories had preserved the outline of an event science itself would take decades to validate. Folklore and anthropology, once divided, seemed to merge upon the shores of Roopkund. Even now, when DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating have given us clearer timelines, when hypotheses of hailstorms and sudden catastrophes dominate scientific journals, the songs still cling to the lake like mist. They do not vanish simply because science offers explanations. Instead, they deepen the mystery. Because science may answer how, but the songs of the curse remind us of the why humans felt compelled to remember, why they framed the disaster as divine justice, and why the bones still seem to sing in silence. There is something profoundly human about this intersection. The villagers, in their music, gave voice to bones that could not speak. They turned tragedy into myth, and myth into warning. And centuries later, scientists with all their instruments found themselves staring at fractures on skulls that looked like the aftermath of celestial punishment. The distance between myth and fact was not wide at all. It was razor thin. The songs of the curse, still sung in the region, may sound like echoes of an old world, but they also remind us that memory, when bound in rhythm and rhyme, can outlast kingdoms, languages, even entire civilizations. The skeletons may never tell us their names, but the folklore has already given them an identity. A king, a queen, a caravan, struck down by the heavens. Whether by goddess or by storm, their fate lives on in song. And so, every time the wind rattles across Roopkund, every time thunder rolls over the ridges, one cannot help but hear the faint resonance of those ballads, not just as superstition, but as something closer to truth than anyone imagined. The songs, like the bones, endure, unbroken by time, unbent by doubt, and inseparable from the mystery of the lake itself. The discovery of the bones should have been the end of the mystery. After all, when science is brought into the equation, uncertainties are supposed to vanish. Yet, in the case of Roopkund, the so-called skeleton lake, every attempt to explain only made the shadows deeper. By the 1950s, anthropology had begun to emerge as a modern discipline in India. Teams of scientists, archaeologists, anthropologists, even medical experts were dispatched to the frozen Himalayan basin, where hundreds of skeletons rested beneath the shallow water. They expected to confirm the obvious, that the bones belonged to a single tragic event, perhaps a military caravan ambushed at high altitude, or maybe a group of pilgrims overtaken by storm. But almost immediately, the evidence fought back. The bones spoke, but they spoke in contradictions. Some skulls were male, broad and angular, as if belonging to warriors or laborers. Others were female, delicate, with smaller frames. Some bones suggested middle-aged individuals, hardened by a life of toil. while others bore the smooth texture of youth. The remains were not uniform. They came from men, women, and children of different builds, different lives, and perhaps different times. Forensic specialists examined the marks and fractures across the skeletons. Many skulls bore deep depressions, as if struck by something heavy. The wounds were peculiar, not from blades, not from arrows, not from the weapons of war. Instead, the injuries were circular, concentrated at the top of the skulls, as if each victim had been bludgeoned from above. The theory that emerged was as grim as it was strange. Had these people been killed by the sky itself? Hailstones, massive and unrelenting, raining down with the force to shatter bone? It sounded implausible, but the fractures were difficult to deny. Still, there were more mysteries than answers. By the 1960s, radiocarbon dating was applied to some of the remains. The results only deepened the enigma. Rather than pointing to a single catastrophic event, the tests suggested the skeletons were not all from the same century. Some bones were dated as far back as the 7th or 8th century. Others appeared to belong to people who had died as recently as the 19th. Generations apart, yet preserved side by side in the same icy grave. The lake, it seemed, had not witnessed one tragedy, but many. Perhaps it had served as a cruel stage across centuries, claiming lives again and again. A cycle of death, repeated through time, leaving behind a layered archive of bones. This revelation shattered the neat narrative of a single calamity. Roopkund was not just a tomb, but a palimpsest of human suffering. Scientists tried to make sense of the timeline. Were these pilgrims returning over centuries to pay homage at Nanda Devi's shrine, only to be caught in storms again and again? Were they armies, crossing through treacherous passes, undone by the mountain's wrath? The mountains hold memory differently from us. Snow falls, glaciers shift, the earth churns. What lies beneath does not decay in a linear fashion. Instead, the dead of one century sleep alongside the dead of another, frozen together in eternal silence. By the late 20th century, more advanced techniques brought genetics into the investigation. Mitochondrial DNA testing revealed another shock. The remains did not belong to a single ethnic group. Some of the individuals were of South Asian descent, consistent with local populations. But others carried genetic markers closer to those found in distant Mediterranean regions. How had they come to rest in this remote Himalayan basin? The discovery raised tantalizing possibilities. Were these outsiders traders, explorers, or mercenaries? Or were they part of some long-forgotten pilgrimage that extended beyond the boundaries of the subcontinent? Each revelation fractured the narrative further, turning certainty into speculation, answers into riddles. Yet despite the contradictions, one fact remained undeniable. Every group that entered the valley separated by centuries, by culture, by lineage, had met the same fate. Their final resting place was the same shallow lake, their bones preserved in its icy water, their deaths unexplained. The scientific reports, far from silencing the legends, had breathed new life into them. Local folklore spoke of a goddess angered by trespassers, striking them down with iron balls from the sky. How eerily close that sounded to the hailstone theory proposed by anthropologists. Was the myth not a story at all, but a cultural memory of a disaster witnessed across generations? By the turn of the millennium, Roopkund was no longer just an archaeological puzzle. It had become a mirror. To scientists, it reflected the frustrating limits of their methods. To villagers, it reaffirmed the power of their ancestors' stories. And to the wider world, it revealed a chilling truth, that even in the age of modern science, there are places where bones refuse to lie, where death resists explanation. The lake had guarded its dead for centuries. It had endured explorers, scientists, and storytellers. Each had come searching for clarity, but each left with more questions than they had arrived with. And so, the skeletons remained silent, unyielding, refusing to align themselves into any single truth. Perhaps that is the essence of Roopkund's enigma. Not that it hides an answer, but that it contains too many. A site where myth and science converge, where the dead refuse to be catalogued neatly into history. A place where every bone unearthed whispers a story that cannot be verified, only imagined. The more the lake revealed, the more it concealed. For in Roopkund, death is not an event, it is a cycle. For centuries, the mystery of the skeletal lake defied explanation. Piles of bones scattered across the remote Himalayan basin seemed to whisper of violence, of suffering, of some catastrophe frozen in time. But when researchers began to analyze the cracked skulls more closely, an extraordinary detail emerged. These fractures were not jagged wounds from battle, nor the long splintering breaks left by weapons. They were smooth, round depressions, as if the skulls had been struck by blunt, rounded objects that came from above. The conclusion was startling. The injuries bore a chilling resemblance to the kind caused by hail. Not ordinary hail, but massive, ice-hard stones hurtling from the sky with deadly force. Some scientists compared the impact to falling rocks, yet there were no landslides, no traces of boulders near the bodies. Instead, the fractures aligned perfectly with the rare phenomenon of giant hailstorms, storms so violent they could shatter bone in a single strike. To outsiders, the idea sounded impossible, almost absurd. But for those who lived near the lake, the explanation carried an unsettling familiarity. Local folklore, passed down in haunting chants and ancient songs, spoke of travelers who once dared to cross the high mountain passes, only to be punished by the gods. The goddess of the peaks, it was said, rained down stones of ice as large as cricket balls upon the intruders, crushing their skulls and scattering their lifeless bodies into the valley. The bones, lying in eerie silence for centuries, suddenly seemed to echo this legend. Science and myth appeared to converge. In the early 2000s, meteorologists were called to weigh in. They confirmed that freak hailstorms of this magnitude, though rare, were not beyond the realm of possibility. Across parts of India and South Asia, records existed of hailstones larger than baseballs, dense, solid, and moving with deadly velocity. In recent history, entire villages had reported crops destroyed and livestock killed in a single afternoon of icy bombardment. If such storms could devastate a community in the modern era, imagine the vulnerability of a caravan or a group of pilgrims caught unprotected on an exposed Himalayan ridge. Picture the scene. Dozens of travelers trudging across the barren mountain pass, exhausted from thin air and brutal winds. The sky darkens. Then it begins not snow, not rain, but a deluge of ice, each stone hard enough to kill. With no shelter, no caves, no structures to shield them, the people would have stood exposed beneath the onslaught. Panic would set in, screams swallowed by the howling wind, bodies collapsing one by one as hailstones smashed into their skulls. Within minutes, the group could have been annihilated, their belongings scattered and buried in ice, their story silenced. The bones at the lake supported this grim picture. Many of the skeletons revealed injuries isolated to the head and shoulders, the precise areas one would expect hail to strike with lethal accuracy. Meanwhile, the rest of the body showed little evidence of trauma, ruling out a violent clash or armed conflict. It was as if the sky itself had chosen where to strike. Yet, the more researchers explored the theory, the more unsettling it became. Why here? Why this lake, tucked away at over 16,000 feet above sea level? Was it simply a matter of chance, or was this site cursed, fated to host the deaths of those who dared to pass? The folklore hinted at something darker, that the storm had been a divine punishment, not a natural accident. And when villagers spoke of the goddess's wrath, it was not with metaphor, but with a conviction rooted in centuries of fear. What makes this theory uniquely chilling is not just its scientific plausibility, but its resonance with human vulnerability. Modern civilization, armed with technology and forecasting, still finds itself helpless in the face of nature's violence. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis each serves as a reminder that human beings are not masters of their world, but fragile bodies beneath an indifferent sky. For those ancient travelers, caught without warning, the storm would have felt apocalyptic. Even today, standing on the rim of the skeletal lake, one cannot help but imagine the sound. Not the silence of bones and wind, but the deafening roar of hailstones hammering the earth. Shattering skulls, echoing off the mountainsides like drums of war. The thought lingers that somewhere in the violence of that storm, legend was born. The goddess of ice had spoken, leaving her warning etched into human remains. And yet, as convincing as the hailstorm theory seems, it does not solve everything. Not all the skeletons bear identical injuries. Some appear older than others. Genetic studies revealed that the bones belong to multiple groups, separated by centuries of time. Could the same deadly phenomenon have occurred more than once, across generations? Was the lake not just the site of a single calamity, but a recurring trap where travelers met the same fate under the same brutal sky? If so, the mystery deepens further. Were these victims pilgrims, soldiers, or traders? Were they caught in isolated events of weather? Or was there indeed something cursed about the path itself? The hailstorm theory provides a harrowing explanation, but like the storm it describes, it leaves chaos in its wake answering one question while unleashing dozens more. Perhaps that is the true nature of the skeletal lake. Not a puzzle with a single solution, but a haunting reminder of fragility, of chance, of the thin line between myth and science. The skulls shattered by hailstones may indeed tell the story of a storm, but they also tell the story of how legends endure, binding human memory to the merciless hand of nature. For centuries, Roopkund Lake was whispered about as a resting place of forgotten souls. But when modern science finally examined the skeletons in detail, the results revealed a story far stranger than anyone expected. The bones, preserved by ice and altitude, were not from a single tragedy, nor from a single people. They belonged to individuals who lived centuries apart, whose origins stretched across vast distances. When researchers studied their DNA, a revelation shook the foundations of Himalayan history. Many of the remains carried the genetic signatures of South Asia, confirming what might have been expected: pilgrims, traders, or wanderers from the Indian subcontinent. But interspersed among them were skeletons of men and women whose ancestry traced not to Asia at all, but to the distant Mediterranean. Their genetic patterns aligned with populations from Greece, Crete, and other corners of southern Europe. How could such people have reached this desolate corner of the Himalayas, nearly 5,000 meters above sea level? And more importantly, what brought them all to the same frozen grave? The Mediterranean individuals were not scattered anomalies. They were a substantial group, buried within the same icy basin as their South Asian counterparts. Radiocarbon dating added another layer of intrigue. The South Asian skeletons dated to around the 7th to 10th centuries, while the Mediterranean group appeared centuries later, closer to the 17th or 19th centuries. This was not one disaster, but multiple tragedies, separated by hundreds of years, converging upon the same lake. Historians scrambled for explanations. Some suggested these Mediterranean outsiders may have been mercenaries or adventurers, drawn to the Himalayas during the colonial era. Others believed they could have been traders traveling through vast transcontinental routes, seeking profit in the perilous mountain passes. Yet there is no record of any Greek or Mediterranean expedition ever reaching these slopes. Their presence is a historical silence, written only in their bones. The strangeness did not end there. Their diet, reconstructed from isotopic analysis, suggested foods that were foreign to the Himalayas. They carried in their bodies the imprint of diets rich in barley, wheat, and grapes crops abundant in Europe, but scarce in the high mountains of Uttarakhand. Even at the end, their biology carried echoes of a homeland thousands of miles away, a stark contrast against the rice and millet signatures of the South Asian dead. One theory paints them as part of an aristocratic European expedition, perhaps colonial officials or wealthy travelers led by curiosity and hubris into dangerous terrain. The 19th century was an era of fascination with the exotic, where wealthy outsiders often sought to conquer landscapes and cultures they scarcely understood. But Roopkund offers no record of such a journey. No maps, no journals, no accounts of Mediterranean aristocrats meeting their fate in the Himalayas. Only bones, silent and unclaimed. The mingling of these two groups, the South Asian pilgrims and the Mediterranean outsiders, raises unsettling questions about Roopkund itself. Why did tragedies repeat themselves in the same location? Was the lake cursed, drawing death across centuries? Or was its treacherous setting a high, narrow basin prone to rockfalls, avalanches, and sudden storms, simply a magnet for disaster? Some researchers point to local legends of Nanda Devi, the mountain goddess said to unleash fury upon those who trespass. Folklore speaks of outsiders punished for their arrogance, struck down by divine wrath in storms of hail and ice. When scientists studied the skulls, many bore deep fractures consistent with massive hailstones, lending eerie weight to the myth. Could the Mediterranean travelers have unknowingly walked into a sacred land, meeting the same fate as pilgrims centuries before them? Yet others see the story differently. To them, the lake was not a curse, but a crossroads, an accidental archive of human movement across ages. The Himalayas, though seemingly isolated, were never closed off from the wider world. They were threads in a vast tapestry of migration, trade, and exploration. The Mediterranean bones, rather than anomalies, could be hidden evidence of forgotten exchanges between civilizations. Perhaps the mountains concealed a history too faint for written records, preserved only in silence and snow. The more the evidence was examined, the less the story seemed like a single chapter in history, and more like overlapping echoes. South Asians came first, centuries earlier, their pilgrimage ending in sudden catastrophe. Centuries later, Mediterranean outsiders appeared, strangers in the same land, meeting the same fate. Two groups, two times, one lake bound together by mystery. The people who carried these bones up the mountain never imagined their story would be pieced together by DNA and isotopes, long after their names and nations were lost. And perhaps that is why Roopkund's enigma endures. It is not simply a tale of death in the Himalayas. It is a story of strangers who should never have met, whose journeys, separated by centuries, converged in the same frozen silence. They lay beneath the ice, their bones whispering across centuries, yet their identities remain suspended between history and myth. Who were these men and women who carried themselves into the heart of Roopkund? Their deaths speak loudly, but their lives are shadows that must be traced through the larger tides of history. To understand them, we must first understand the currents of faith, survival, and power that shaped the Himalayas between the years 800 and 1800. The first thread draws us into devotion. Across these mountains, a pilgrimage unlike any other has endured for over 1,000 years, the Nanda Devi Rajjat, a journey of faith, perilous and sacred, stretching for weeks across cliffs, forests, and glaciers. Pilgrims traveled in vast groups, singing hymns to the goddess Nanda Devi, carrying offerings to her shrine. It was not a journey of leisure, but of surrender, a ritual meant to test the spirit and cleanse the soul through suffering. For some, death along the path was not failure, but sacrifice, woven into the divine narrative of devotion. The bones at Roopkund may have been pilgrims who sought her blessings, only to be caught in the merciless snows that the goddess herself was believed to command. If so, their journey was not interrupted, but completed. There remains an eternal hymn frozen into the mountain. Yet devotion was not the only reason humans wandered these slopes. Long before national borders carved the map, these peaks served as arteries of commerce. Traders from the plains of India and the Tibetan plateau wove through them, carrying salt, wool, and turquoise in one direction, grains, spices, and cloth in another. They risked storms and avalanches to maintain a delicate web of exchange. For these traders, survival meant profit, and profit meant braving the gods' domain. The travelers at Roopkund may not have been pilgrims at all, but merchants caught between destinations, their cargo now scattered beneath centuries of ice. Perhaps they were ordinary men and women, driven not by faith, but by the simple need to live. A reminder that commerce and devotion often walk the same road, though for different masters. But history holds yet another possibility. These were not pilgrims nor traders, but refugees. The centuries between 800 and 1800 were not peaceful ones. Dynasties rose and fell in the plains below. Wars burned villages. Famine stalked the land. Entire communities were uprooted. The Himalayas became not only a boundary, but also an escape route. People fled into the mountains in search of safety, believing the peaks could shield them from the chaos below. But the mountains were no sanctuary. They were executioners disguised as refuge. The refugees may have found themselves trapped in storms they could not endure, their stories silenced by the very earth that promised salvation. Each possibility reshapes how we see the dead. If they were pilgrims, they died in pursuit of the divine. If they were traders, they died in pursuit of survival. If they were refugees, they died in pursuit of peace. Yet behind all three lies the same truth. The Himalayas were never passive. They demanded reverence, courage, and sacrifice, and they claimed the lives of those who underestimated them. The socio-political history of these centuries sharpens the mystery rather than solves it. In the early medieval period, kingdoms across northern India competed for territory, wealth, and control of trade. Dynasties like the Cholas, the Palas, and later the Delhi Sultanate all left echoes across these lands. Religious movements spread through pilgrimages and sacred journeys, drawing countless travelers upward. Simultaneously, Mongol incursions, famine cycles, and shifting monsoon patterns forced countless others onto paths they would never have chosen. To move through the Himalayas was to be caught in the intersection of faith, commerce, and necessity, three forces strong enough to drive anyone to the edges of endurance. This convergence also reminds us that human identity is rarely singular. The dead at Roopkund may not fit neatly into one category. A pilgrim could also be a trader, carrying wares along with offerings. A refugee might cloak their journey as a pilgrimage to gain shelter or acceptance. A trader might join a devotional procession for protection. The truth is likely layered, just as the bones themselves are layered in ice and sediment. The mountain did not preserve pilgrims or traders or refugees. It preserved human beings whose lives defied simple labels. Even today, the Nanda Devi Rajjat pilgrimage continues, drawing thousands across the same rugged paths. Songs are still sung, offerings still made, and the mountain still looms in silent judgment. Those who march today may walk past the very place where their ancestors fell, a reminder that faith and survival are never without risk. The mystery of Roopkund is not only about death, but about what compels people to move, across kingdoms, across trade routes, across glaciers. Pilgrimage, trade, and exile are all different faces of the same impulse, the refusal to stay still in a world that demands movement. And so the bones remain, silent but eloquent, suspended in a question that may never be answered. Not pilgrims alone, not traders alone, not refugees alone, but echoes of all three. Their deaths are less a riddle to solve and more a mirror of humanity itself, restless, searching, enduring, even in the face of impossible odds. The silence of Roopkund Lake is unlike any other. Beneath its shallow waters, where the snow recedes for only a few short months each year, The dead have left behind more than just bones. They have left fragments of their lives, preserved with startling intimacy, as if time itself refused to let them go. Among the skeletal remains, locks of hair still cling stubbornly to brittle skulls. Some strands are coarse and dark, others fine and faded to a ghostly silver. The high-altitude air, devoid of moisture and saturated with ice, has kept these details intact for centuries. To stare at them is to feel the breath of the past brushing against your skin. These were not nameless specters. They were people who combed their hair, who tied it back, who once looked into reflective waters before they began their final journey into the clouds. Fragments of clothing rest between the rocks, woolen cloaks, torn by weather, but still vibrant enough to suggest patterns. One scrap bears traces of intricate weaving, the kind that must have belonged to someone of means, someone who walked with pride, carrying color into the bleak terrain. Another piece is simple and practical, thick enough to protect against the brutal wind, belonging perhaps to a laborer or a pilgrim who had little more than survival in mind. The clothing paints a spectrum of humanity, from rich travelers to humble seekers, drawn together by some mysterious thread of fate. Wooden artifacts emerge from the ice, like whispers of forgotten rituals. A staff, smooth from years of touch, lies near a skeleton bent forward as if collapsed mid-stride. Was it a walking stick or a ceremonial object carried in devotion? Wooden beads, threaded into crude necklaces, have been recovered too. They rattle faintly in the wind, each one carved by hand, suggesting a story of faith, of offerings made to gods, or perhaps to ancestors. The lake does not answer. It only holds these relics in stillness. Jewelry gleams among the stones, a sharp contrast to the decayed remains. Tiny bangles of copper and glass glisten faintly, catching what little sunlight filters through the clouds. Some of these ornaments are small enough to have adorned children. Others belong to women or men who valued beauty, even on their perilous journey into the Himalayas. A ring, carefully shaped, clings stubbornly to the bone of a finger that has long since withered. One cannot help but wonder, was it a gift from a lover? A sign of status? Or perhaps a talisman of protection, carried into the mountains with desperate hope? Forensic study has transformed these objects from silent curiosities into testaments of life. The preserved hair has been analyzed, revealing dietary traces, some heavy with millet, others with rice, suggesting travelers came from different regions of India. Isotopes in the water trapped within their remains confirm journeys that began far from this frozen lake. This was not the story of a single village caught in misfortune. It was a convergence of strangers, bound by pilgrimage or circumstance, who all met the same unrelenting end. Even the footwear tells its tale. Rough sandals, stitched with animal hide, speak of the poor, who braved jagged stones with little more than resolve. In contrast, leather boots with reinforced soles show the wealthier pilgrims who climbed prepared, perhaps with servants and supplies. Yet on the icy banks of Roopkund, wealth and poverty were stripped of meaning. All became equal beneath the falling snow. Each fragment, hair, fabric, wood, metal, is more than a relic. It is a frozen time capsule, a shard of identity suspended between life and death. When pieced together, they form not a single mystery, but a mosaic of tragedies. A mother clasping jewelry that might have been meant for her child. A pilgrim gripping a wooden staff, determined but doomed. A traveler wearing fine garments, his pride meaningless in the shadow of the storm. The image is haunting because it is not abstract. These were people caught in the raw cruelty of nature, stripped of the illusions that history often grants its subjects. They were not heroes in epics or villains in legends. They were human, carrying with them the same anxieties, ambitions, and small treasures that we cling to today. In their belongings, we see a reflection of ourselves. The necklace we would never take off, the keepsake we would pack, even when traveling light, the ring we would hope to pass down. Roopkund has often been described as a mass grave, but this is not entirely true. Graves are dug with intention, carved by the living for the dead. Roopkund is something else, a natural tomb carved by ice, where fate alone arranged the bodies and scattered their possessions. It is a place where the final hours of hundreds are held in suspension, waiting to be read like a text written in bones and cloth. What stands out most is not the brutality of their deaths, but the fragile intimacy of what remains. These fragments are echoes of life. They are not abstract data for scientists alone, nor macabre curiosities for travelers who stumble upon them. They are voices, and though silent, they speak clearly that human beings, in their fragility and hope, carry themselves into places where death waits, unflinching. In this way, Roopkund becomes less a mystery and more a mirror. It reflects the lengths to which people will go for faith, for belonging, for reasons perhaps lost to history. The lake did not take them because they were careless, but because they were human. And to be human is to risk everything in pursuit of meaning. Even now, as snow falls and the wind scours the mountains, their belongings remain where they fell. Each spring thaw reveals a new fragment, another clue in a puzzle without resolution. The artifacts are not simply relics of tragedy. They are testimonies to devotion, to endurance, to the final steps of those who climbed toward the sky and never returned. In Roopkund, time has not erased them. Time has preserved them, holding them for us to see, to remember, and perhaps to feel. For decades, Roopkund Lake resisted explanation. Bones, artifacts, folklore, all offered fragments, but never the whole story. Then, in 2019, one of the most extensive genetic and isotopic studies ever conducted on the remains forced a rethinking of everything we thought we knew. The results did not solve the mystery. Instead, they deepened it. The DNA extracted from dozens of skeletons revealed two distinct groups. One cluster carried genetic ancestry rooted in South Asia, men and women whose lineages tied them to regions of the Indian subcontinent. But the second group carried ancestry astonishingly different, tracing back to the eastern Mediterranean, over 4,000 kilometers away. It was as if strangers from opposite ends of the world had converged on this tiny Himalayan lake, only to die centuries apart, their bones mingling beneath the ice. Radiocarbon dating confirmed this uncanny reality. The South Asian remains dated back to around 800 to 1000 CE, but the Mediterranean group belonged to a far later period, roughly the 1800s. That meant Roopkund was not a single tragedy frozen in time. It was a stage of death revisited, where separate groups, separated by centuries, were claimed by the same unrelenting mountain. The lake did not tell one story. It told many. Even more striking was the absence of obvious weapons or signs of battle. Trauma on the skulls matched the blunt force pattern consistent with the hailstorm theory, massive ice stones crashing from the sky. Others bore no trauma at all, suggesting death from exposure, starvation, or altitude sickness. Roopkund, it seemed, was a silent killer that wore many faces, sometimes storm, sometimes cold, sometimes thin air. And through the centuries, it waited. To the villagers of Uttarakhand, this revelation was uncanny. Their old ballads spoke of divine wrath, stones of ice sent by a goddess to punish trespassers. Modern science now seemed to echo their words, though stripped of myth. What they called the anger of a goddess, researchers now called hail the size of cricket balls, falling with lethal speed and over 100 kilometers per hour. Folklore and science stood side by side, like two languages describing the same terror. But the mystery of identity remained unsolved. Who were the Mediterranean travelers so far from home, climbing into this inhospitable corner of the Himalayas? Pilgrims seeking spiritual absolution? Explorers drawn to the sacred peaks of Nanda Devi? Or perhaps traders, caught in the wrong season, Their caravan destroyed by the weather? No record in European or South Asian history tells of such a journey. No chronicle remembers their names. Yet their bones lie in Roopkund, mingling with strangers who had perished centuries before. The lake, it seems, collects stories without telling them. Every melt of the snow reveals not answers, but more fragments. A new skeleton, a broken artifact, a clue that refuses to settle into certainty. And perhaps that is its nature, not to reveal a neat ending, but to remind us of the fragility that ties all human lives together. Roopkund is no longer just an archaeological site. It is a mirror of humanity's oldest truths, that people will climb where the earth is cruel, driven by faith, by trade, by desperation. That nature does not distinguish between the rich and the poor, the native and the foreigner, the pilgrim and the wanderer. When the storm falls, when the cold arrives, all are the same. What is most haunting is not that hundreds died here, but that hundreds tried to live here, in this impossible place. They brought food, jewelry, staffs, shoes, stories, and hopes into a realm that could never sustain them. Their presence is proof of the timeless pull of the mountains, beautiful, sacred, deadly. Today, scientists continue to test the remains, sequencing genomes, measuring isotopes, redating the bones. Each study refines the picture, but none resolves it. The lake has guarded its dead for centuries, and even in the age of modern science, it refuses to surrender its full truth. Roopkund is not a puzzle waiting for one last piece. It is a story without an ending, and so the questions remain. How many stories of migration, faith, and survival lie buried in forgotten corners of the earth, waiting for the ice, the desert, or the forest to give them back? How many myths hide fragments of real history, disguised in song and legend? And when the snow melts again on Roopkund, what other skeletons of history will rise to the surface, reminding us that time never truly buries the past, it only hides it, waiting to return? Roopkund is the lake that will not answer, and perhaps that is its most powerful truth.